Have you ever stood before the ancient stones of Stonehenge and wondered about the minds that conceived such wonders? Or perhaps you've imagined the flickering torchlight of a Celtic ritual deep within an oak forest, where shadowy figures chanted to forces beyond our understanding. These images stir something primal within us, a curiosity about those who held the keys to knowledge long before written history. Today, we're setting out on a journey to uncover one of history's most fascinating and elusive groups, the Druids. More than just priests or wise elders, the Druids were the intellectual elite of ancient Europe, philosophers, judges, healers, and spiritual guides who shaped the beliefs and laws of Celtic societies for centuries. Their legacy is woven into the very landscape of myths and monuments, yet so much of their story remains shrouded in mystery, waiting to be explored. In the rolling green hills of Ireland, where myth and history intertwine like Celtic knots, the Druids held a place of profound reverence. They were the keepers of oral tradition, the advisors to kings, and the interpreters of the natural and supernatural world. Imagine a time when education wasn't written in books but memorized over 20 years of rigorous training. These learned individuals didn't just preside over ceremonies, they influenced politics, settled disputes, and preserved the cultural identity of their people through poetry, astronomy, and sacred lore. Their wisdom was said to connect the earthly realm with the divine, making them indispensable to their communities and feared by those who did not understand their power. What makes the Druids especially compelling is how their story challenges our modern perceptions of history and spirituality. They left no written records of their own, yet their influence echoes through Irish legends, archaeological findings, and even the very language and customs that endured for millennia. As we delve into their world, we'll uncover how these enigmatic figures shaped not only ancient rituals but also the core values of Celtic culture: courage, honor, and a deep kinship with nature. You'll discover why the Druids were far more than mysterious figures in white robes. They were the heart and mind of a civilization whose echoes we can still hear today. So join me as we step into the mists of time to meet the Druids, the philosophers, the judges, the seekers of truth, and explore the enduring legacy they left behind. To truly understand the Druids, we must first cast aside the common image of a singular, mystical figure chanting in a grove. Their role was far more complex and integrated into the very machinery of Celtic society. Think of them not as a separate, shadowy priesthood, but as the ultimate multidisciplinary scholars, the professors, judges, and scientists of their time. They formed the highly educated upper echelon, a class of intellectuals whose wisdom was the glue that held the spiritual and societal worlds together. Their training was famously rigorous, a mental marathon that could span 2 decades, committed entirely to memory because they operated within a rich oral tradition. Writing down their sacred knowledge was believed to weaken its power and make it accessible to the unworthy, so every law, every prayer, every star chart, and every historical lineage had to be perfectly preserved in the mind. This immense responsibility meant a Druid was a walking library, a living repository of all their people's accumulated knowledge. This vast expertise translated into a multitude of essential public functions. As priests, they were the intermediaries between the people and the myriad gods and spirits that inhabited the Celtic world, conducting the necessary sacrifices and rituals to ensure good harvests, victory in battle, and the favor of the other world. But their influence extended far beyond the sacred grove. Druids were the supreme legal authorities, the judges who settled disputes between tribes and individuals. Their judgments were absolute, grounded in a deep understanding of Brehon law, a complex, sophisticated system that governed everything from property rights to reparations for harm. A king's power was not absolute, it was checked and guided by the Council of the Druids. They were the chief advisors, their wisdom sought on matters of war, peace, and diplomacy. To ignore a Druid's counsel was to risk both earthly failure and divine disfavor. Their titles and specializations were as varied as their duties. While Druid is the term we use broadly, this intellectual class included specific roles. The Fili were master poets and seers, whose beautifully composed verses could satirize an enemy into disgrace or bless a king with prosperity. The Baird were bards, the storytellers and musicians who preserved the history and genealogy of the people through epic tales. Then there were the healers, who possessed an extensive knowledge of herbal medicine and the natural world, and the astronomers who could read the movements of the stars and celestial bodies to mark the sacred seasons and festivals like Samhain and Imbolc. This wasn't a homogeneous group but a sophisticated network of experts, each mastering a branch of knowledge, all working in concert to guide, heal, and preserve their culture. They were, in every sense, the beating heart of Celtic life, woven so deeply into the fabric of their society that to imagine ancient Ireland without them is to imagine a body without a mind. To grasp the true scale of the Druids' influence, we must first step back and survey the vast and vibrant stage upon which they operated, the sprawling Celtic world of the Iron Age. This was not a single, unified empire but a magnificent tapestry of diverse tribes, stretching across the European continent from the misty shores of Ireland all the way to the highlands of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. These tribes, the Gauls in France, the Celtiberians in Spain, the Galatians in Turkey, and the Britons and Gaels in the British Isles, among many others, were connected not by a central government or a single flag, but by something far more powerful, a shared cultural and linguistic heritage. They spoke closely related languages that branched from a common Celtic root, and this mutual intelligibility, however nuanced by region, was the first thread in a much larger cultural fabric. This shared identity expressed itself through strikingly similar art, technology, and social structures. Wherever you found Celtic people, you would recognize their unique artistic flair, the intricate, swirling Latin style of metalwork, characterized by elegant spirals and triskells woven into weapons, jewelry, and ritual objects. Their societies were organized in a familiar tribal structure, led by chieftains or kings whose power was balanced by a warrior aristocracy and, crucially, by the learned class of the Druids. They worshipped a pantheon of deities with similar attributes, though the names might change from region to region. Lug in Ireland was analogous to Lugus in Gaul, just as Brigid found her reflection in Brigantia. This common spiritual ground was perhaps the most important factor, creating a universal need for a specialized class to interpret the will of the gods. It was this profound cultural commonality that allowed the Druidic class to operate with an astonishing degree of prestige and mobility across tribal boundaries. A Druid from one tribe could travel to the lands of another and be received with immense respect, their authority and wisdom recognized instantly. They formed a kind of intellectual and spiritual network that transcended the frequent political and military conflicts between chieftains. Their role as diplomats and intermediaries was vital. A Druid could negotiate a truce or an alliance between warring tribes with an authority that a mere warrior or king could not, precisely because their judgment was seen as emanating from a higher, divine wisdom that served the greater good of all the people, not just one tribe's ambition. This pan-Celtic recognition made them the ultimate keepers of order and continuity, a living bridge that connected the scattered tribes of Europe through a shared understanding of the world, the cosmos, and their place within it. This profound influence across such a vast territory makes their historical silence all the more intriguing, for the Druids themselves left us no written accounts of their beliefs or practices. Unraveling their story is an exercise in historical detective work, a challenging endeavor where we must piece together a puzzle from fragments that are often incomplete, biased, or open to interpretation. Our understanding is built upon three distinct pillars of evidence, each with its own strengths and significant limitations, and each requiring careful scrutiny. Our first window into their world comes from the writings of their adversaries and observers, Greek and Roman authors. Figures like Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, provide some of the most detailed, albeit politically motivated, descriptions. He portrays the Druids as powerful judges and teachers, noting their belief in the transmigration of the soul and their central role in human sacrifice. Claims meant to shock a Roman audience and justify his military campaigns by painting the Celts as barbaric. Pliny the Elder offers a more anecdotal account, famously describing a ritual for harvesting mistletoe with a golden sickle, a scene that has become iconic in popular imagination. And Tacitus gives us chilling, eyewitness reports of Druids on the island of Mona, cursing Roman soldiers from the shore. While invaluable, these sources are fundamentally problematic. They are external observations filtered through a lens of cultural superiority and imperial propaganda, often emphasizing the sensational and the brutal to serve a narrative of Roman conquest and civilization. Centuries later, a second source emerges from the very lands the Druids once guided, the rich body of medieval Irish and Welsh literature. These manuscripts, like the Irish Ulster cycle and the mythological cycle, are treasure troves of stories featuring Druids as powerful advisors to kings, such as Cathbad in the tales of Cu Chulainn. However, these texts were written down by Christian monks hundreds of years after the fact. While they may preserve kernels of ancient oral tradition, they are not historical records. They are mythologies, often reframed through a Christian world-view where the old gods and magic are diminished or allegorized. The Druid in these stories is sometimes a rival to the new Christian saint, a literary device that tells us more about the time in which the stories were written than the Iron Age itself. They give us color and character, but separating historical fact from literary embellishment is a delicate and often impossible task. This is where our third source of evidence becomes crucial: archaeology. The silent testimony of the land itself, the sacred groves, the ritual deposits in bogs and lakes, the bones of animals from feasts, and the powerful monuments like Tara or the Hill of Uisnech offers a more objective, though enigmatic, perspective. A ceremonial cauldron discovered in a peat bog or the remains of a great communal feast can tell us about ritual practice without the bias of an outside writer. Yet, archaeology rarely provides definitive answers about belief or meaning. We can see what was done, but not why. We can unearth the tools of a ritual, but we cannot hear the chants that accompanied their use. This physical evidence grounds the written accounts in reality, but often leaves the most profound questions about Druidic thought unanswered, reminding us that some mysteries are forever lost to time. While we often use the word Druid as a blanket term for this learned class, the reality was far more structured and specialized. This intellectual elite functioned much like a modern university, composed of distinct faculties, each with its own advanced field of study. The most widely accepted view, drawn from classical sources, divides this group into three primary orders: the Druids proper, the Bards, and the Vates or Ovates. Each held a unique and vital place in the societal fabric, their roles deeply interconnected and mutually supportive, forming a complete system of knowledge, culture, and spiritual guidance. At the apex of this structure were the Druids themselves, the philosophers and jurists. Their domain was the most profound and far-reaching, encompassing theology, natural philosophy, law, and political counsel. They were the ultimate arbiters of truth and justice, the ones who memorized and interpreted the complex Brehon legal codes that governed Celtic society. A dispute over land, a case of injury, or a matter of tribal succession would ultimately be brought before a Druid, whose judgment was considered final and divinely inspired. Their lengthy 20-year education was dedicated to mastering these immense subjects, and they served as the chief advisors to kings. A ruler would never dream of declaring war or forging an alliance without first seeking the guidance of the Druids, for their wisdom was believed to bridge the human world and the will of the gods. They were the master strategists of both earthly and cosmic order. Working in close concert with them were the bards, the keepers of memory and masters of oral art. If the Druids were the judges and lawmakers, the bards were the historians and journalists. Their power resided in the spoken word, perfected through years of rigorous training in poetry, music, and intricate storytelling. They were the living archives of their people, entrusted with memorizing and reciting genealogies that stretched back generations, epic tales of heroes and battles, and the satires that could make or break a chieftain's reputation. A king's legitimacy often depended on a bard's ability to recite his noble lineage publicly. Their performances were not mere entertainment, they were essential acts of cultural preservation and social power. A well-composed praise poem could secure a leader's authority, while a cutting satire had the feared power to bring about disgrace and misfortune, believed to have a tangible, magical effect on its subject. Completing this triad were the Vates or Ovates, the seers and natural philosophers who served as the interpreters of the unseen world. Their expertise lay in divination, healing, and understanding the intricate workings of nature. They were the scientists of their time, possessing a deep, practical knowledge of herbal medicine, anatomy, and the cycles of the seasons. When a sacrifice was made, it was the Vates who would read the entrails for omens, seeking messages from the gods. They observed the flight patterns of birds and the movements of clouds to foretell events. This connection to the physical and spiritual world made them the mediators between the community and the natural forces that governed their lives. While the Druid understood the law of the gods and the bard preserved the history of the people, the Vate could read the immediate signs of what was to come, providing crucial guidance for the present moment. This threefold structure was not a rigid hierarchy but a fluid and collaborative network of intelligence. A single individual might train across these disciplines, and their functions frequently overlapped. A powerful Druid would certainly possess the gift of prophecy, and a skilled bard's words held immense spiritual power. Together, they formed a complete knowledge system. The Druid provided the philosophical and legal framework. The bard gave that framework cultural meaning and historical context through story, and the Vate ensured it remained connected to the immediate signs and rhythms of the natural world. They were three pillars supporting the entirety of Celtic intellectual and spiritual life, each indispensable to the whole. Now consider the sheer magnitude of this educational endeavor, a mental undertaking almost unimaginable in our modern world of written records and digital storage. An aspiring Druid, often chosen from a young age for their intellectual promise or noble birth, would embark on a journey of learning that could span 2 full decades. This was not a casual study, it was a complete immersion into a vast ocean of knowledge, all of which had to be perfectly internalized, organized, and recalled entirely from memory. The entire intellectual heritage of their people, every law, every star chart, every genealogy, every prayer, and every epic poem rested not on parchment or stone, but solely within the minds of these master memorizers. This oral tradition was a conscious and sacred choice. Writing this knowledge down was believed to profane it, to strip it of its inherent power and mystery, and to risk it falling into the hands of the uninitiated. The true power of knowledge was in its careful preservation and controlled transmission from one trained mind to another. The curriculum itself was staggeringly comprehensive, a holistic education that would rival any modern university. A student would begin with the foundational arts of poetry and meter, learning the complex rhythmic structures that made vast amounts of information easier to memorize and recite. They would then advance to the intricate codes of Brehon law, a sophisticated legal system covering everything from property disputes and contracts to reparations for injury and the rules of inheritance. History was not a list of dates but the memorization of lengthy genealogies that connected living chieftains to their divine ancestors, legitimizing their rule and preserving tribal identity. Astronomy was essential for creating the calendars that governed agricultural life, and for pinpointing the precise timings of the 4 great fire festivals like Samhain and Beltane. And woven through all of this was the religious doctrine, the nature of the gods, the rituals for every occasion, and the secrets of the otherworld. This was an education in how the universe worked, from the laws of men to the laws of nature and the divine. This immense feat of memory was achieved through a combination of intense discipline and sophisticated mnemonic techniques. Students learned to associate information with complex poetic meters, creating a rhythmic scaffolding that made recitation more accurate. They visualized knowledge being stored in different mental rooms or attached to symbolic trees, a method known as the memory palace technique that is still used by mental athletes today. Every lesson was repeated and refined through constant recitation under the watchful eye of their master, until the knowledge became as natural as breathing. The goal was not just rote memorization, but a deep, intuitive understanding that allowed the Druid to draw upon this vast repository to solve new problems, settle novel disputes, and provide counsel for situations that ancient verses may not have explicitly covered. They weren't just hard drives storing data. They were the living, breathing processors of that data, the active interpreters of a timeless wisdom for the challenges of their present day. To see the Druids not as historical figures but as living, breathing characters, we need only turn to the epic tales of Irish mythology, where they stride onto the stage as pivotal players in the dramas of gods and heroes. These stories, preserved in medieval manuscripts like the Ulster and mythological cycles, offer our most vivid literary portraits, painting the Druids not as background priests but as essential agents of power, prophecy, and sometimes peril. They are the advisors who whisper in the ears of kings, the seers whose visions set entire narratives in motion, and the masters of magic whose powers can rival those of the deities themselves. Through these legendary figures, we get a sense of the immense respect and awe the Druids commanded in the Celtic imagination long after their historical prominence had faded. Consider the formidable Cathbad, the chief Druid of King Conchobar mac Nessa's court in the Ulster cycle. He is far more than a royal chaplain. He is a kingmaker, a teacher, and a prophet whose words forge destinies. One of the most famous tales recounts how the young hero Setanta, later known as Cú Chulainn, came to Cathbad to learn the art of divination. Upon asking if that particular day was auspicious for taking up arms, Cathbad delivered a prophecy that would define a legend. He declared that any young man who took up arms on that day would achieve everlasting fame, but his life, however glorious, would be tragically short. Embracing this fate without hesitation, Setanta accepted his weapons and began his journey to become the greatest hero of Ireland, the Hound of Ulster. This story perfectly encapsulates the Druid's role. He possesses the knowledge of fate itself, and his pronouncements are not mere predictions but active forces that shape the course of history, setting heroes on their paths with full awareness of the triumphs and sacrifices to come. The power of prophecy is also wielded with chilling effect by the Druidess Fedelm in the epic Tain Bo Cuelnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. When Queen Medb of Connacht is amassing her vast army to invade Ulster and steal the legendary brown bull, Fedelm, a prophetess from the otherworld, appears before her. Medb, confident in her military might, asks the Druidess to look into the future and prophesy how her campaign will fare. In a scene brimming with dramatic irony, Fedelm looks and sees a vision of blood and ruin. She tells the queen that she sees crimson, I see red, foretelling the vast host of Ulster's warriors, led by the invincible Cú Chulainn, who will decimate Medb's forces. Unwilling to hear this truth, Medb dismisses the prophecy, attributing it to the young seer's lack of support for the cause. But Fedelm's vision is unshakable and accurate. She embodies the classic archetype of the Cassandra-like figure, possessing true sight that those in power foolishly ignore to their own doom. Her role underscores that the Druid's wisdom, whether heeded or not, is an immutable force, Beyond prophecy, these mythological druids are also masters of potent and direct magic, capable of enchanting people and manipulating the very fabric of reality. In the same Ulster cycle, the druid Cathbad is again shown using his abilities for more than foresight. He and his students are said to have the power to create magical illusions called Fethfyda, a mist of concealment that could hide an entire army from view. They could compose incantations known as glom dyson, satires so powerful they could raise boils on the face of their target, a potent form of magical punishment for breaking oaths or social codes. This portrayal elevates them from advisors to active wielders of supernatural power, their art form poetry and spoken word being the very medium of their magic. Their words did not just describe the world, they could change it, bless or curse, protect or destroy. This deep interconnection between language, knowledge, and tangible power is the core of their mystique in these myths, presenting them as the indispensable link between the human realm and the boundless magic of the otherworld. This authority placed the Druid in a position of tremendous secular power, effectively making them the power behind the throne. A king might wear the crown and command the warriors, but his rule was legitimized and guided by the Druids' wisdom. Their counsel was sought on every critical decision, from the most mundane matters of domestic policy to the grave choices of war and peace. Before a king would ever raise a spear against a rival tribe, he would first consult with his druid to discern the will of the gods and the likely outcome of the conflict. This was not a mere formality, it was a necessary step to ensure both divine favor and strategic success. The Druids' analysis would have considered everything from celestial omens and seasonal timing to the complex web of alliances and the reputation of the opposing chieftain. To ignore this counsel was to risk not only military defeat but also a loss of honor and the perceived disfavor of the cosmos itself, a gamble no prudent ruler would take. In the realm of diplomacy, the Druids' role was equally indispensable. Their unique status as a pan-Celtic intellectual class granted them a form of diplomatic immunity, allowing them to travel between warring tribes to negotiate treaties and truces with an authority that a king's emissary could never possess. A king's word could be seen as self-serving, but a Druid's judgment was believed to be rooted in a higher, impartial truth that served the greater cosmic order. They were the ultimate mediators, capable of resolving conflicts that might otherwise have descended into generations of bloodshed. This ability to transcend tribal loyalty and appeal to a shared understanding of law and honor made them the glue that held the often fractious Celtic societies together, preventing total chaos and maintaining a delicate balance of power across the landscape. Ultimately, the true source of the Druids' unparalleled influence was their perceived role as the upholders of cosmic order. Celtic society was deeply interwoven with a spiritual worldview where the human realm and the natural world were reflections of each other. Justice among people maintained harmony with the gods, while injustice could bring drought, famine, or defeat. The Druid was the guardian of this delicate balance. Their legal judgments settled earthly disputes, but on a deeper level, they were performing a ritual act that realigned society with the divine. A king's power was temporary and terrestrial, but a druid's authority was eternal and cosmic. The king ruled the tribe, the druid sustained the very order of the universe that made the tribe's existence possible. This fundamental belief is why the Druids' word was final, their authority absolute, and their presence the true source of power in any chieftain's court. Yet at the heart of all their political and intellectual authority lay their most fundamental and awe-inspiring role, that of spiritual conduit. The Druids were the essential bridge between the community and the divine, the only ones with the specialized knowledge to perform the rituals that maintained the fragile balance between the human world and the powerful, often capricious forces of the other world. Their entire society operated on a principle of reciprocity with the gods. Prosperity, health, and victory were not given but earned through correct observance and offering. It fell to the Druid to oversee this sacred exchange, a responsibility that placed them at the very center of the community's spiritual and physical well-being. A failed ritual wasn't just a ceremonial error. It could mean a blighted harvest, a lost battle, or a plague upon the people. The most critical of these duties was presiding over sacrifices, acts of profound significance intended to nourish the deities and secure their continued favor. The archaeological record, particularly from bogs across northern Europe, provides tangible evidence of this practice in the form of beautifully crafted cauldrons, weaponry, and great quantities of animal bones, often from prized livestock like cattle, clearly deposited as offerings. These were not casual gestures but elaborate communal events directed by the Druids. According to Roman commentators like Julius Caesar and Strabo, this practice could, in moments of extreme crisis such as imminent famine or the threat of invasion, extend to human sacrifice. Caesar writes of vast wickerwork figures filled with living victims and set ablaze, a claim that has been heavily debated by modern scholars. While Roman accounts are undoubtedly biased, designed to portray the Celts as barbaric to justify conquest, the possibility remains a dark and controversial facet of their rituals, a stark reminder of the high stakes they believed were involved in their communion with the divine. These ceremonies were never performed in man-made temples but in spaces the gods had already sanctified, the natural world. The Druids sought out locations believed to be thin places where the veil between the mortal realm and the otherworld was at its most permeable. A grove of ancient, towering oaks was considered the most sacred of all sanctuaries, a living cathedral where every rustle of leaves could be a divine whisper. They also gathered at crystal-clear wells and springs, sources of life that emerged mysteriously from the underworld, and upon powerful, wind-swept hilltops that seemed to touch the sky. At these sites, the Druid's role expanded from priest to master of ceremonies, orchestrating the entire ritual. They would determine the precise timing based on astrological observations, prepare the offering with the correct invocations, and interpret the signs that followed. The pattern of a beast's entrails, the flight of a bird disturbed by the smoke, the crackle of the sacred fire, to discern whether the offering had been accepted and the gods were appeased. In these moments, standing between the people and the infinite, the Druid was truly the keeper of the cosmos. Their profound connection to the spiritual was matched only by their masterful understanding of the physical world, for the Druids were, in many ways, the premier scientists of their age. They viewed the cosmos not as a collection of separate subjects, but as a single, interconnected system where the movements of the heavens directly influenced the growth of plants, the health of the people, and the right moment for every action. This holistic wisdom made them true masters of the natural world, with a sophisticated grasp of astronomy, medicine, and the subtle energies that later observers would simply label as magic. Their knowledge was both practical and profound, a blend of keen observation and spiritual insight that allowed them to navigate and manipulate the forces of nature with a skill that seemed supernatural to outsiders. Their most visible and enduring scientific achievement was their intricate understanding of astronomy, which formed the very backbone of their society. The great monuments scattered across the Celtic landscape, like the magnificent complex at Newgrange in Ireland or the alignments at Stonehenge in Britain, stand as silent testament to their celestial prowess. These were not just tombs or temples, they were sophisticated astronomical observatories, precisely engineered to capture the light of the sun on the solstices and equinoxes. The Druids used these precise alignments to construct a highly accurate calendar that governed every aspect of life. They didn't merely track days, they tracked the great cyclical rhythms of the cosmos. This allowed them to pinpoint with absolute certainty the dates of the four great fire festivals Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad, which marked the transitions between seasons and were critical for agriculture, husbandry, and the timing of all major rituals. Knowing exactly when to plant, when to harvest, when to breed livestock, and when the veil between worlds was thinnest was a form of power, and the Druids held the keys to this celestial clockwork. This deep knowledge of the heavens was inseparable from their role as healers. Their medicine was a sophisticated practice of herbalism, where the natural world served as a vast and potent pharmacy. Through generations of careful observation and passed down wisdom, they compiled an extensive understanding of the properties of native plants, fungi, and minerals. They knew which herbs could ease a fever, which poultices could heal a wound, and which berries were lethally poisonous. The willow tree provided bark rich in salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin for pain and inflammation. Meadowsweet, which contained salicylic acid, was used to treat headaches and arthritis. They understood the antiseptic qualities of honey and the healing power of certain mosses when applied to cuts. This was not mere folk medicine, it was a proto-scientific system based on empirical results. A healing druid would diagnose an ailment, often through a combination of physical observation and divination, and then compound a specific treatment from the earth's bounty, sometimes chanting incantations over the mixture to invoke the spirit of the plant itself, believing the cure resided in both the physical substance and the spiritual intention. It was this seamless blending of observable science and spiritual practice that led their Roman conquerors and later imaginations to perceive them not as scholars but as powerful magicians. The Romans, who documented their own encounters and collected rumors, were both fascinated and horrified by the Druids' abilities. They reported on the Druids' capacity to prophesy the future through the flight of birds or the convulsions of a sacrificed victim. They spread tales of their power to control the weather, to summon mists to conceal entire armies, a tactic that could have a very practical military explanation, but seemed like sheer sorcery to the disciplined Roman legions. The most enduring image from Pliny the Elder is of the Druid in a white robe climbing an oak tree to harvest mistletoe with a golden sickle, ensuring the plant never touched the ground to preserve its sacred power. To the Roman mind, steeped in their own state-sponsored religion, these practices were not the acts of philosophers but of dangerous sorcerers who needed to be eradicated. This perception of the Druid as a shapeshifter or master of illusion was further cemented in the native myths that survived into the Christian era. The early Irish tales are filled with Druids who can cast Feth Fiada, a mist of concealment, or use a glom Dyson, a satirical poem so powerful it could raise boils on the face of its target. They were said to have the ability to transform themselves or others into animals, to fly through the air, or to curse the land of a rival king so it would no longer bear fruit. While these are literary embellishments, they stem from a core truth. The Druids' command of knowledge was so complete, their understanding of psychology, chemistry, and natural phenomena so advanced that their actions produced results that seemed to defy the normal laws of nature. They weren't just priests chanting in the woods, they were the intellectuals who knew the secrets of the stars, the properties of every plant, and the power of the human mind, making them the most formidable and mystical figures in the ancient world. For the Druids, time was not a straight line marching toward a distant future, but a great turning wheel, its rhythm set by the sun, the moon, and the very breath of the earth itself. Their entire worldview was cyclical, mirroring the endless patterns of birth, growth, death, and rebirth they witnessed in the natural world. To live in harmony with this cosmic cycle was to ensure prosperity and avoid chaos, and the Druids were the master timekeepers who read the celestial signs to maintain this essential balance. They didn't just track days and months, they orchestrated the spiritual and agricultural life of their people around a sacred calendar, punctuated by 4 great fire festivals that marked the year's crucial turning points. These were not mere holidays, they were powerful, liminal moments when the barrier between the human world and the other world grew thin, and the entire community participated in rituals designed to secure the favor of the gods for the season to come. The year began in darkness, not with light, at the festival of Samhain, celebrated from sunset on October 31st into November 1st. For the ancient Celts, this was the most potent and fearsome night of the year, the moment when the vibrant summer world met the silent, dormant world of winter. It was the end of the harvest and the beginning of the new year, a time when herds were cold and the community prepared to hunker down for the cold months ahead. But more importantly, the Druids taught that on Samhain, the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead was at its very thinnest. The spirits of ancestors were thought to return to visit their homesteads, and other, less benevolent beings from the otherworld could also cross over. Great communal bonfires were lit on hilltops, serving as beacons of protection and purification. The Druids would oversee these sacred flames, from which every hearth in the community would be relit, symbolically carrying the tribe's collective spirit into the new year. People would often wear masks and costumes to confuse any hostile spirits wandering abroad. It was a night of profound duality, a somber acknowledgement of death and decay, but also a celebration of the enduring connection to those who had passed, a belief that continues to echo in our modern Halloween. As the deepest winter began to loosen its grip, the next festival arrived to coax the land back to life. Imbolc, held on February 1st. This was a celebration of the first faint stirrings of spring, a time of purification and hopeful anticipation. The name Imbolc is thought to derive from the Old Irish for "in the belly," a reference to the pregnant ewes who were about to give birth, ensuring a vital supply of milk. The entire festival was dedicated to the goddess Brigid, the exalted one associated with poetry, healing, and the sacred fire of the forge and the hearth. Under the Druids' guidance, households would perform rituals of cleansing, airing out their homes after the long winter. They might create a Brigid's cross from rushes or straw, a protective solar symbol hung over the door. The Druids would likely have observed the behavior of animals and the first signs of new growth to prognosticate the coming season's weather and the success of the upcoming planting. Imbolc was a quiet, reflective, yet hopeful festival, a gentle kindling of the inner flame of creativity and resilience after the long, dark sleep of winter. With the land now fully awake and fertile, the mood of the year shifted dramatically at Beltane, celebrated on May 1st. If Samhain was the festival of darkness and the dead, Beltane was its opposite, a joyous, vibrant, and unabashed celebration of light, life, and fertility. This marked the beginning of the bright half of the year and the official start of the summer pastoral season, when cattle were driven to their summer grazing lands. The Druids would light two great bonfires on hilltops, and the people would ritually drive their livestock between these fires, a practice known as need fire. The smoke and flames were believed to purify the animals, protecting them from disease and misfortune before their journey. Doors and windows were decorated with yellow mayflowers, and young people would venture into the woods to collect hawthorn branches and flower garlands, a ritual brimming with the energy of new life and potential romance. The Druids oversaw these rites to ensure the community's vitality and the land's fruitfulness, calling upon the sun's power to bless the tribe and its livelihood. Beltane was a time of pure, unadulterated optimism, where the whole world seemed charged with creative potential. The final turn of the annual wheel came with Lugnasad, held around August 1st, a festival of first fruits and the beginning of the harvest season. Named for the god Lug, a master of all arts and skills, this was not a somber event but a massive communal gathering, a time for great athletic contests, horse races, feasting, and the forging of contracts and alliances. It was a celebration of the community's collective effort and the promise of sustenance through the coming winter. The Druids would perform the initial ritual cutting of the first sheaf of grain, an act of profound religious significance that honored the spirit of the grain itself and ensured the continued abundance of the crop. This was also a primary season for handfasting or trial marriages, which would last for a year and a day. People would climb hills and mountains in ritual reenactments of Lug's ascent, and fairs were held where craftspeople could display their finest work. Lugnasad was essentially a huge national convention, a moment of thanksgiving, commerce, and social bonding, all orchestrated by the Druids to give thanks for the bounty of the earth and to strengthen the ties that held the community together before the cycle began anew with the coming darkness of Samhain. This commitment to a purely oral tradition was not born from a lack of sophistication or a simple aversion to writing. It was a deeply held philosophical principle that defined the very essence of Druidic power. In a world where our most valuable knowledge is instantly digitized and broadcast globally, their choice seems almost incomprehensible. Yet for the Druids, the act of writing was seen as a dangerous degradation of sacred wisdom, a process that would inevitably strip their teachings of their inherent spiritual potency and transformative power. They believed that true knowledge was a living, breathing force, not a static collection of symbols on a page. Committing their laws, histories, and prayers to writing would, in their view, freeze this living wisdom into a dead letter, making it vulnerable to misinterpretation by the uninitiated and separating it from the vital energy of the human voice and mind that gave it meaning. The power was in the transmission, not just the information. This protective stance served an immensely practical purpose. It was the ultimate safeguard of their authority and the most effective form of copyright protection imaginable. By keeping their vast repository of knowledge locked within a trained, initiated class, the Druids ensured that their role as the indispensable advisors to kings and the interpreters of the divine remained unchallenged. If every farmer could read the legal codes or every warrior could study the rituals from a scroll, the unique status of the Druidic class would evaporate. This control over information was the bedrock of their political and social influence. It created a necessary barrier to entry, ensuring that only those who had undergone the decades of rigorous mental and spiritual discipline could access and, more importantly, correctly interpret this powerful knowledge. It wasn't about hoarding for its own sake. It was about maintaining the integrity and correct application of a system they believed was too powerful to be handled carelessly. The sheer act of memorization itself was also seen as a sacred, transformative ritual. The 20-year educational journey was not merely about data acquisition. It was a forge for the mind and character. The intense discipline required to internalize thousands of verses of law, genealogy, and astronomy fundamentally shaped the student into a different kind of thinker. This process cultivated immense focus, profound mental discipline, and a towering intellectual capacity. The knowledge didn't just reside in their memory, it became a part of their very being, woven into their neural pathways through years of repetition and recitation. A Druid didn't recall a legal precedent, they embodied the law. They didn't quote a prayer, they channeled it. This intimate, embodied relationship with knowledge meant that every utterance was infused with the weight of their entire training, giving their words an authority and a perceived power that a written decree could never hope to match. This oral method also guaranteed an astonishing level of accuracy and purity in the transmission of their teachings across generations. In a written culture, texts can be copied with errors, altered by later editors, or interpreted out of context centuries later. The oral tradition, by contrast, was a self-correcting system. Knowledge was passed directly from master to student in a tightly controlled lineage. Any deviation in a recitation would be instantly corrected by the master, ensuring that the sacred formulas and historical narratives were preserved with near-perfect fidelity. The use of complex poetic meters, alliteration, and rhythmic patterns acted as a mnemonic framework, making lengthy recitations easier to memorize and harder to corrupt accidentally. This created an incredibly stable and consistent body of knowledge that could survive for centuries without a single word being written down, a testament to the power and reliability of the trained human mind as the ultimate archival tool. This immense cultural and intellectual system, however, was about to face an existential threat from a foreign power whose worldview could not have been more different. The expansion of the Roman Empire into Celtic lands was not merely a military campaign. It was a brutal clash of civilizations, a systematic effort to dismantle a way of life that Rome viewed as both barbaric and dangerously subversive. At the heart of this cultural conflict stood the Druids, whom the Romans correctly identified not as simple priests, but as the very core of anti-Roman resistance. They understood that to conquer the Celtic spirit, they first had to break its most powerful leaders. Our most detailed and influential window into the Roman perspective comes from the writings of Julius Caesar himself in his commentaries on the Gallic War. As a brilliant general and a shrewd politician, Caesar's accounts are a fascinating mix of first-hand observation and calculated propaganda. He describes the Druids with a degree of respect for their learning and social function, acknowledging their role as judges, teachers, and philosophers. Yet, he consistently emphasizes their practice of human sacrifice, detailing horrific accounts of prisoners being burned alive in massive wicker effigies. For his Roman audience, these descriptions were not neutral anthropology. They were a deliberate portrayal of a savage culture that required the civilizing hand of Rome. By framing the Druids as barbaric sorcerers engaged in inhuman practices, Caesar provided the moral and political justification for his brutal conquest of Gaul. He wasn't just fighting armies, he was waging a war against what he depicted as a monstrous priesthood. The Roman state swiftly came to a strategic conclusion. The Druidic order was a seditious entity that had to be eradicated. They were not seen as mere religious figures, but as the central nervous system of Celtic resistance, a networked intellectual class that could rally tribes across vast distances against Roman rule. Their authority transcended the tribal divisions that Rome often exploited, making them the single greatest obstacle to total conquest. In response, the Roman Senate took unprecedented action. Under emperors like Tiberius and Claudius, official decrees were issued that formally banned Druidic practices throughout the empire. These were not mere proclamations of religious intolerance. They were acts of political warfare designed to decapitate the leadership structure of Celtic society and sever the people's connection to their own laws, history, and spiritual identity. To practice as a Druid became a capital offense. This official policy of eradication was enforced with terrifying brutality on the ground, nowhere more famously than on the island of Mona, known today as Anglesey in Wales. In the year 60 of the Common Era, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led a full-scale military assault on this last great stronghold of the Druids in Britain. The Roman historian Tacitus gives us a chilling account of the scene that greeted the legionaries as they approached the shore. The opposite bank was lined with a roaring, chaotic army of native Britons, but standing ominously silent among them were the Druids. Their hands raised to the sky, they hurled terrible curses at the invading troops, their women swirling like furies among them with torches in their hair. For a moment, this terrifying spectacle of raw, otherworldly power froze the superstitious Roman soldiers in their tracks, but the pause was brief. Suetonius Paulinus rallied his men, shouting that they should not fear a bunch of fanatical women and mad priests. The professional discipline of the legion overcame their primal fear, and they surged forward, cutting down the defenders and overrunning the sacred island. What they did next was a deliberate act of cultural annihilation. They systematically destroyed the sacred groves, the nemetons that were the Druids' open-air temples, and razed their altars to the ground. The invasion of Mona was more than a battle. It was a symbolic crushing of the Celtic spirit under the iron heel of Rome. It sent an unambiguous message that the old gods were powerless against the might of the empire, and that their interpreters had no place in the New World Order. This military and political assault, combined with the relentless spread of Roman urbanization, law, and culture, slowly but surely pushed the vibrant Druidic tradition to the fringes of the known world, forcing its profound knowledge into hiding and irrevocably altering the course of European history. While the Roman legions succeeded in stamping out Druidism across much of continental Europe and Britain, the story in Ireland took a dramatically different turn. Shielded by the sea from the might of the Roman Empire, Ireland remained a land unconquered, its native culture and intellectual classes left to evolve without the crushing pressure of military subjugation. This isolation became the key to survival. When Christianity finally did arrive on its shores, it wasn't carried by soldiers but by missionaries, most famously St. Patrick in the 5th century. This distinction is everything. The conversion of Ireland was not an act of forced cultural annihilation imposed from the outside, but a slower, more organic process of negotiation and fusion from within. The result wasn't the extinction of the old ways, but their remarkable transformation. The new Christian monks and the native Druidic learned class discovered they were not natural enemies, but rather kindred spirits. Both were, at their core, communities of intellectuals dedicated to the preservation of knowledge through immense mental discipline. The Druids had spent generations memorizing the law, history, and poetry of their people. The early Irish Christians in their remote monasteries were equally committed to the meticulous copying and preservation of sacred texts and indeed all knowledge. They recognized a shared value for learning and saw the utility in the existing social structures. Instead of tearing down the old system, they found a way to build upon it. The Druids, the Fili, and the Bards were far too valuable to simply discard. They were the very backbone of Irish culture and identity. What followed was one of history's most fascinating acts of cultural synthesis. The old Druidic elite didn't vanish, they seamlessly transitioned into the New World Order. A master poet, a file, could just as easily compose a praise poem for a local chieftain as he could a hymn to a Christian saint. The intricate Brehon laws, once memorized and adjudicated by the Druids, were now written down and interpreted by a new class of lay jurists who are often the literal descendants of those same Druidic families. The most telling example of this integration is found in the great illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells. The pages explode with vibrant, intricate artwork that is unmistakably Christian in its subject matter, yet the visual language is purely Celtic. Those iconic spirals, triskells, and interlacing patterns that once adorned ritual objects and stone carvings now frame the Gospels, baptizing the native artistic spirit into a new faith. This syncretic spirit extended to the very landscape and calendar. Sacred wells and springs, once sites of Druidic veneration, were rededicated to Christian saints, their healing waters still sought after for blessing. The festival of Imbolc, sacred to the goddess Brigid, was effortlessly transformed into Saint Brigid's Day, with the saint inheriting many of the goddess's attributes as a patroness of poetry, healing, and the hearth fire. Even Samhain, the potent festival of the dead, found its echoes in the new Christian observances of All Saints and All Souls' Day. The underlying rhythm of the Celtic year, so carefully tracked by the Druids, persisted, simply wearing a new Christian cloak. This wasn't a defeat for the old ways, it was a strategic and brilliant assimilation. The body of native wisdom found a new soul, ensuring that the legacy of the Druids, their knowledge, and their deep connection to the land would flow like an underground river through Irish culture, forever shaping its unique character. For the ancient Celts, the world we perceive with our five senses was only a small part of a much grander, more mysterious reality. Just beyond the veil of the everyday lay the other world, a parallel dimension of breathtaking beauty and profound power. This was not a distant heaven or an underworld of punishment, but a realm intimately intertwined with their own, a place of eternal youth, feasting, and joy known by many names, most famously as Tir na an Og, the land of the young. Imagine a world where time stood still, where sickness and decay were unknown, and where the very trees and rivers shimmered with a magical vitality. This was the domain of the gods, the spirits of nature, and the ancestors, and the Druids were the revered gatekeepers who held the keys to this unseen realm, acting as the essential bridge between the human and the divine. The connection between these two worlds was not abstract, it was woven into the very geography of the Celtic landscape. the Druids taught that there were specific, powerful locations where the boundary between the worlds grew thin and porous, places where one could literally feel the presence of the other world. A sudden mist rolling in from the sea could be seen as the breath of the other world touching the land. A lone, ancient hawthorn tree standing in the middle of a field or a deep, still forest pool might be a doorway. Certain caves, wells, and especially the great Neolithic burial mounds like those at the Brú na Bóinne complex were believed to be direct portals. The most potent of these thresholds were the Shia mounds, the earthen fortresses of the gods, where at specific times of the year, like Samhain, the doors between the worlds were said to swing open. The Druids were the cartographers of this mystical geography, the only ones who could safely navigate these liminal spaces and interpret the signs of contact. This role as an intermediary was one of their most vital functions. When the community faced a drought, a plague, or a string of bad fortune, it was believed that the balance between the worlds had been disrupted. Perhaps an important ritual had been neglected or a taboo had been broken, offending the inhabitants of the other world. The people would turn to their druid to diagnose the problem. Through divination, reading the patterns of clouds, the flight of birds, or the entrails of a sacrifice, the druid would seek to understand the will of the gods and spirits. They would then prescribe the correct offering or ritual to appease them and restore harmony. In this way, the druid was more than a priest. They were a diplomat negotiating between two interdependent kingdoms, ensuring the flow of blessings from the other world and maintaining the cosmic order that allowed their people to thrive. Their responsibilities extended beyond the lives of their people into the great mystery of what comes after. The Druids were also the guides of souls, the psychopomps who shepherded the dead on their journey to the next life. Celtic belief, as recorded by classical authors, held a powerful concept of the transmigration of the soul, the idea that the spirit did not die with the body but was reborn, either in this world or in the other world. The Druids' wisdom was crucial in this transition. They would perform the necessary funeral rites to ensure the soul was correctly prepared and released from its earthly ties. It was believed that a druid could even recognize the soul of a departed ancestor in a newborn child. This profound belief in an eternal cycle of death and rebirth, overseen by the Druids, alleviated the fear of mortality and reinforced the unbreakable bond between the tribe, its ancestors, and the timeless, magical realm that lay just a glimpse away. But this connection to the unseen was not a passive one. The Druids and their seers, the Vates, actively sought to read the messages they believed were constantly being sent from the other world. For a chieftain considering war or a community facing a poor harvest, the future was not a mystery to be endured, but a text to be deciphered through a sophisticated array of divinatory arts. This was not mere superstition. It was a systematic science of interpretation, a way to gather intelligence from the divine realm to guide critical decisions in the mortal one. The will of the gods was written in the patterns of nature, and the Druids were its most fluent readers. One of the most revered and widespread methods was augury, the practice of interpreting the will of the gods through the observation of bird flight and behavior. The sky was a vast, ever-changing canvas upon which divine messages were painted. A Vate would carefully note the species of bird. A raven might signal battle and strife, while a swan could indicate peace and travel, as well as the direction from which it came. The specific patterns of its flight were meticulously analyzed. Birds flying from the right were often considered a favorable omen, while those approaching from the left could portend misfortune. The sound of their calls, the numbers seen together, even the way they landed on a branch, every detail was a potential piece of a larger puzzle. Before any major undertaking, a king would rely on his seers to take the auspices, to spend hours in quiet observation of the heavens, seeking a clear sign that the gods favored their plan or warning them to hold back. For messages that came not under the sun but under the veil of sleep, the Druids turned to oneiromancy, the interpretation of dreams. They believed that during sleep, the soul was less tethered to the body and could travel into the other world or receive communications from its inhabitants. Vivid or recurring dreams were not dismissed as random neural firings. They were considered significant prophecies or warnings that required expert decoding. A dream of a great feast might foretell a coming period of prosperity, while dreaming of a crumbling fort could indicate a threat to one's health or authority. The key was in the symbolism, and the Druids were the psychoanalysts of their age, skilled in unraveling the metaphorical language of the subconscious and the divine. A chieftain might summon a Druid to interpret a troubling dream before making a weighty judgment, believing it contained crucial intelligence about the path ahead. Perhaps the most direct and to modern sensibilities disquieting method was extispacy, the reading of the future through the examination of an animal's entrails, most commonly the liver of a sacrificed sheep or goat. This was a highly formalized ritual performed by the Druids themselves. The act of sacrifice was itself a sacred communication, an offering made to the gods. In return, it was believed the deities would leave their answer within the very organs of the consecrated animal. The Druid would carefully remove the liver and inspect its lobes, its color, its texture, and any unusual markings or imperfections. The shape of the gallbladder or the appearance of the portal vein held specific meanings, all of which were compared against a mental catalogue of signs learned during their decades of training. A smooth, healthy, normally shaped liver was a powerful affirmative sign, a green light from the gods. Any abnormalities, spots, cysts, or misshapen lobes were interpreted as warnings or negative omens, a clear signal to abandon or reconsider the proposed course of action. The influence of these prophecies on the course of Celtic history cannot be overstated. A positive divination was the essential prerequisite for any major military campaign. No king would ever lead his warriors into battle without the confident assurance that the gods were marching with them. A single unfavorable omen, like a flock of birds flying inauspiciously or a blemished liver, could delay an invasion or cause an entire army to retreat, as the risk of divine disfavor was deemed far greater than any earthly foe. This spiritual intelligence was also paramount in the process of selecting and inaugurating a new king. The rightful ruler was not merely the strongest warrior or the most noble by birth. He was the individual whose destiny was confirmed by the omens as being in harmony with the land and the gods. The Druids' reading of the signs legitimized the king's rule, transforming a political appointment into a divine mandate and ensuring the stability of the tribe by demonstrating that their leader had the unwavering support of the other world. Forget the image of grand stone temples erected by human hands. The true sanctuary of the Druids was the untamed world itself. Their most profound rituals and deepest contemplations did not occur within man-made walls, but under the vast, open sky in places pulsating with natural power. While the great megaliths of Stonehenge capture our modern imagination, it's crucial to remember those monuments were already ancient ruins in the time of the Celts, remnants of a people long forgotten. The Druids instead sought out living, breathing spaces where the boundary between the earthly and the divine felt whisper-thin. Their entire spiritual worldview was one of animism, the belief that spirits and consciousness resided in every mountain, tree, and stream. This made the whole of the natural world a cathedral, and the Druids were its itinerant priests, moving from one sacred site to another to conduct their holy work. Chief among these natural temples were the nemetons, the sacred groves. The very word evokes a sense of hallowed ground, derived from the Celtic root nemeto, meaning a sacred space or a sanctuary. These were not random clusters of trees, but specifically chosen groves of towering oaks, revered above all others for their strength, longevity, and the wisdom they seemed to embody. Imagine entering such a place, the sunlight filtering through a dense canopy of leaves, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and vegetation, the only sounds being the rustle of branches and the distant call of a bird. This was a space entirely removed from the daily life of the hill fort and the farm. Within this natural vault, the Druids would conduct their most important ceremonies. The oak was especially sacred, believed to be a conduit to the heavens, and the mistletoe that grew upon its branches was considered a potent symbol of life and divine blessing, to be harvested with a golden sickle in a ritual so iconic it was recorded by Roman observers like Pliny the Elder. Equally potent were the sources of water that emerged mysteriously from the underworld. Sacred wells and springs were seen as direct portals to the otherworld, places where the earth itself gave forth life-giving and spiritually charged water. These weren't just sources of drinking water, they were places of healing, divination, and petition. A well dedicated to a goddess of healing might be visited by those seeking a cure, where they would leave a small offering, a piece of cloth tied to a nearby tree, a coin tossed into the depths as a prayer for intercession. The Druids would oversee these rituals, interpreting the bubbles that rose to the surface or the patterns of light on the water as messages from the spirits within. River confluences, where two powerful bodies of water met to form a third, were also sites of immense power, seen as places of merging, decision, and amplified energy, perfect for rituals requiring great spiritual force. The high places of the land held a similar draw. Prominent hills and mountains, like the legendary hill of Uisneach in Ireland, considered the mystical center of the island, were believed to bring one closer to the sky gods. Climbing such a peak was a spiritual act in itself. Upon the summit, the Druids could feel the wind, witness the approach of storms, and track the movements of the sun, moon, and stars with unobstructed clarity. These locations were often used for the great seasonal fire festivals. Lighting a bonfire on such a prominent hill was a spectacular act of symbology, a point of human-made light on a natural altar, connecting the community below with the celestial fires above, a beacon of ritual that could be seen for miles around, uniting the tribe in a shared spiritual moment. In this seamless integration with the landscape, we see the Druids not as separate from nature, but as active participants in a living, breathing cosmos, their reverence for the land shaping a spirituality that was both immediate and profoundly deep. While the classical texts give us only fleeting glimpses, the image they paint of a Druid is one of striking and deliberate symbolism. According to Roman observers like Pliny the Elder, the most senior Druids were often distinguished by their attire of undyed white robes. This choice of color was far from arbitrary. In the ancient world, white was universally associated with purity, sanctity, and a connection to the celestial realms. For a people who held their ceremonies under the open sky, the color white would have mirrored the clouds and the light of the sun and moon, visually setting the Druid apart as a figure who operated between the world of humans and the domain of the gods. This simple yet powerful garment marked them as separate from the everyday warrior or farmer, their role defined not by martial prowess but by spiritual and intellectual authority. This authority was physically manifested in one of their most iconic ritual tools, the ceremonial sickle, crafted not from iron but from gold. Pliny provides our most vivid account of its use in the ritual harvesting of mistletoe, a plant of immense sacred power that was believed to be a gift from the heavens, especially when found growing on a revered oak tree. The use of a golden sickle was deeply symbolic. Gold, as a metal that never tarnished, was associated with the eternal, the divine, and the sun. It was deemed the only metal pure enough to cut a plant so charged with spiritual energy without contaminating it. The act of cutting the mistletoe was a highly choreographed ceremony, requiring precise timing, often at the 6th day of the moon, and the plant must never be allowed to touch the ground, lest its sacred potency be lost. This wasn't a tool for farming, it was an instrument of ritual, a key to unlocking the healing and blessing properties of the natural world. Beyond their tools and robes, the ultimate symbol of a Druid's high rank and sacred office was the torque, a rigid metal neck ring typically fashioned from gold, bronze, or iron. These were not mere pieces of jewelry, they were heavy, prestigious emblems of status, power, and divine connection. Worn by both elite men and women in Celtic society, the torque was a badge of nobility, but for a Druid, it likely held an even deeper significance. The open circle of the torque, with its often elaborately decorated terminals, may have symbolized the cyclical nature of existence that was central to their belief system. The endless turning of the seasons, the stars, and the journey of the soul. To wear a torque was to visibly declare one's place at the very pinnacle of the social and spiritual hierarchy, a person whose words and judgments carried the absolute weight of tradition and the gods. It is crucial, however, to sharply differentiate this historical picture from the popular imagery that often springs to mind today. The modern neo-pagan depiction of the Druid, heavily influenced by Romantic Victorian-era revivals, frequently shows a bearded, elderly man in a long, hooded white robe and bearing a staff, perhaps standing solemnly at Stonehenge. While this image is powerful in its own right and holds meaning for contemporary spiritual paths, it is more a reflection of 18th and 19th century Romanticism than of Iron Age reality. The historical Druids were not reclusive hermits or generic nature priests. They were integrated, powerful figures at the very heart of political, legal, and social life. Their appearance, from their white robes to their golden sickles and prestigious torques, was designed to command immediate respect and signify their immense earthly authority as much as their spiritual role. They were the sharp, learned minds guiding a civilization, and their symbols were those of office, power, and a profound, active engagement with both their community and the cosmos. This distinction between the spiritual framework and its intellectual guardians is absolutely essential for a clear understanding. It's a common modern misconception to use the term Druidism as a label for the entire Celtic religion, as if it were a specific sect like Christianity or Buddhism. In reality, the spiritual life of the ancient Celts is more accurately described as Celtic polytheism, a vibrant, diverse tradition of worshipping a vast pantheon of deities, spirits, and ancestral figures. The religion itself was the belief system, the stories of the gods, and the devotional practices of the everyday person. Druidism, on the other hand, was something different entirely. It was the highly structured practice, the philosophical school, and the professional class that served and guided that broader religious tradition. Think of it this way: Celtic polytheism was the spiritual ocean in which all the people swam. It was the air they breathed, encompassing their beliefs about the creation of the world, the nature of the gods like the mighty Dagda, the skilled Lug, and the triple-faced Brigid, and the rituals they performed at home to ensure protection and prosperity. An ordinary farmer leaving an offering of milk for a local land spirit, a warrior whispering a prayer to the Morrigan before battle, a household honoring the hearth goddess — these were all acts of Celtic polytheism. They required no formal training or initiation. This was the folk religion, the faith of the people, passed down through families and woven into the fabric of daily seasonal life. Druidism was not this religion itself, but rather the sophisticated, institutionalized body that organized its highest expressions and integrated it with law, history, and science. To be a Druid was to have a profession, a vocation that demanded decades of the most rigorous mental training. One could be a perfectly devout and respected Celtic polytheist without ever undergoing a single day of Druidic education. The average person participated fully in the religion without needing to understand the complex astronomical calculations that determine the timing of the fire festivals or the intricate legal precedents stored in a Druid's mind. Their faith was personal and immediate, while the Druid's role was to be the custodian of the cosmic and societal order that faith upheld. The relationship is perhaps best understood through a modern analogy. Consider the field of medicine. The pursuit of health and the treatment of illness is the broad, universal goal. This is like Celtic polytheism, the overarching objective of connecting with the divine and maintaining cosmic harmony. However, the medical doctors, surgeons, and specialists who spend over a decade in university and residency learning anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical procedures represent the structured, professional class that serves that goal. They are the equivalent of the Druids. One can pursue health through good diet and exercise without being a doctor, just as an ancient Celt could venerate the gods without being a Druid. The Druids were the theologians, the philosophers, the judges, and the master ritualists, the highly educated experts who applied their deep knowledge to serve the spiritual and societal needs of their people, operating within the framework of Celtic polytheism, but constituting a distinct and elite intellectual practice within it. The enduring image of the Druid as a solemn, bearded patriarch is one of history's most persistent oversimplifications, effectively erasing a powerful and well-documented class of women who wielded equal authority in the spiritual and intellectual life of the Celts. These women, known in Old Irish as Bandrui, literally woman druid, were not rare exceptions or mystical outliers. They were an integral part of the Druidic order, serving as seers, healers, legal arbiters, and masters of magic in their own right. The evidence for their existence, preserved in both the accounts of classical observers and the rich corpus of medieval Irish literature, paints a picture of a society where spiritual and political power was not segregated by gender, but was instead accessible to anyone who could endure the monumental mental discipline of the Druidic path. Roman writers who so famously documented the male Druids also took note of their female counterparts, often with a mixture of fascination and alarm. The Greek geographer Strabo, compiling earlier sources, explicitly listed three honored classes among the Celts: the Bards, the Vates, and the Druids. He then noted that among these groups, women were held in singular esteem. The historian Pomponius Mela, writing in the 1st century, described a group of 9 priestesses on an island in Gaul who were renowned for their oracular powers, their ability to heal the incurable, and their capacity to control the weather through incantations. Most chillingly, he recounted how these women were served by locals who would approach them on their hands and knees, and how any servant who stumbled during this approach would be set upon and torn to pieces by the others. A clear, if sensationalized, Roman attempt to convey the terrifying, absolute authority these women commanded. These accounts, while filtered through a foreign lens, confirm that the classical world was well aware of learned Celtic women who operated with a level of autonomy and power that was unthinkable in Greco-Roman society. It is within the native Irish tradition, however, that the Bandrui truly come to life, not as background figures but as pivotal characters who shape the destiny of kings and heroes. We have already met Fedelm, the prophetess from the Tain Bo Cuelnge, whose accurate and terrifying visions of bloodshed Queen Medb fatally ignores. Fedelm is introduced not as a mere fortune-teller, but as a Banfali, a master poetess, and a seer trained in the arts of prophecy in the otherworldly land of Alba. Her confident declaration, "I am a prophetess," and her unwavering conviction in her own vision, even when contradicted by a confident queen, establishes her as a professional whose authority is rooted in recognized skill, not superstition. Beyond prophecy, these women were depicted as possessing the full spectrum of Druidic powers, including the feared ability to curse and satirize. The glom Dyson, a form of poetic satire so potent it could raise boils on the face of its victim or destroy their reputation, was a weapon equally available to male and female practitioners. In one tale, the Druidess Diorbael places a satirical curse on the King of Leinster that causes his face to break out in blisters, forcing him to seek her forgiveness to lift the affliction. This was not simple magic. It was a formalized act of social and legal enforcement, a way to hold even the highest authority accountable through the power of the spoken word, a power that required years of dedicated training to wield effectively. Their roles extended far beyond battlefields and curses into the very heart of governance. Irish texts are replete with references to women who served as chief advisors to kings, their counsel carrying the same weight as that of any male druid. The legendary Queen Medb of Connacht herself, though a ruler, is constantly surrounded by and reliant upon the advice of her own druids, both male and female, for strategic decisions. Another powerful figure, Tílachga, the daughter of the famed druid Mug Ruth, was said to be a mighty druidess in her own right, associated with the hill of the same name where the great Samhain fire was lit. She was a master of astronomy and magic, and her legacy was so potent that one of the most important ritual sites in Ireland was named in her honor, cementing her status not as a secondary character in a man's story, but as a foundational intellectual and spiritual force. The existence and prominence of the Bandrui forces us to completely rethink the social structure of the Celtic world. It suggests a society where the path to power was through knowledge and capability, not solely through gender. A woman willing to undertake the 20 years of grueling mental discipline required to master law, poetry, astronomy, and ritual could achieve a position of immense, uncontested authority. She could advise kings, interpret the law, perform sacrifices, and command the respect of warriors. The Bandrui were not witches on the fringe. They were the professors, the judges, and the scientists of their age, demonstrating that the Celtic intellectual world was a meritocracy of the mind, where the most powerful magic was knowledge itself, and it was a power accessible to all who had the strength and will to seize it. Perhaps the most enduring and tangible legacy of the Druids is not found in mystical tales or sacred rituals, but in the very bedrock of early Irish society, its sophisticated and surprisingly modern legal system known as the Brehon laws. While these laws were committed to parchment by Christian monks between the 7th and 9th centuries, they are not a Christian invention. They are the written codification of a vast, ancient oral tradition, a body of legal wisdom that had been meticulously memorized, debated, and applied by the Druidic intellectual class for centuries prior. This was the practical application of their 20-year education, the framework through which they maintained cosmic and social order. The transition from oral recitation to written text is the key to understanding how Druidic thought seamlessly infiltrated the new Christian era, ensuring its principles would govern Irish life for nearly 1,000 years to come. The core philosophy of Brehon law stands in stark contrast to the punitive, state-centered legal systems of the Roman world. Instead of a focus on crime and punishment against the crown, Brehon law was built on a foundation of restorative justice and compensation. The primary goal was not to inflict pain on a wrongdoer, but to restore balance to the social fabric that had been torn by the offense. Every injury, from the theft of a sheep to the shedding of blood, had a precisely calculated compensation value known as an eric fine. This wasn't a random penalty. It was a complex equation that considered the severity of the act, the status of the victim, the status of the perpetrator, and the intent behind the action. A blow from a chieftain carried a different fine than the same blow from a commoner, reflecting the intricate, status-based hierarchy of Celtic society that the Druids were tasked with upholding. This system effectively prevented the feuds and cycles of violence that plagued other cultures by providing a clear, rational, and agreed-upon path to resolution, a testament to the Druidic belief in balance and harmony as the highest social goods. The role of the Druid as the supreme legal arbiter evolved directly into the role of the Britham, or Brehon, the professional judge who interpreted and applied these laws. Like their Druidic predecessors, the Brehons were not government employees but highly trained specialists who operated independently. Their authority derived not from political power but from their impeccable knowledge of the legal tradition and their reputation for fairness. They were often attached to the courts of local kings, providing the same essential service the Druids always had, checking royal power with the immutable authority of the law. A king could not simply dictate a verdict. He had to rely on the Brehon to recite the relevant precedent and prescribe the correct compensation. This continuity of role is perhaps the clearest example of the Druidic intellectual class simply changing its name and its medium, from memory to manuscript, while retaining its essential function as the keeper of order and the interpreters of a timeless cosmic justice. The substance of these laws further reveals their deeply pre-Christian Druidic origins. Many legal tracts deal with the sacred nature of contracts and the power of the spoken word, a clear echo of the Druidic belief that language itself held creative and binding power. The concept of Fyr Flathiman, the ruler's truth, stipulated that a king's justice and fidelity were directly tied to the prosperity of his land. If he ruled unjustly, the crops would fail and the rivers would run dry. This is a purely Celtic spiritual concept, a holdover from the Druidic teaching that the ruler was the sacred conduit between the people and the land, and his morality directly affected the physical world. Furthermore, the laws show an intricate understanding of the natural world, with specific provisions for the management of bees, water rights, and the seasonal movements of cattle, knowledge that would have originated with the Druids' role as master naturalists and calendar keepers. This remarkable survival meant that for centuries after the arrival of Christianity, the Irish people continued to live their lives, settle their disputes, and structure their society according to a legal and social logic devised by the ancient Druids. The Christian scribes who wrote the laws down may have added a few references to the church or to clerics, but the core principles remained untouched. The focus on status, honor price, and restorative compensation was entirely native. The intellectual framework of the Druids, their commitment to balance, their intricate social taxonomy, and their profound understanding of reciprocity, became the unshakable foundation of Irish society. It proves that their most important legacy was not broken by the Romans or erased by the monks, but was instead quietly, effectively absorbed into the very identity of Ireland, governing the lives of its people from the highest king to the lowest commoner long after the last Druid had passed from memory. For centuries after the collapse of the Celtic world, the Druids faded into the shadows of history, remembered only in fragmented manuscripts and local folklore. But as Europe entered the 18th century, a powerful new cultural movement began to stir, one that would pluck these ancient figures from obscurity and reforge them in an entirely new image. The Age of Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and order, gradually gave way to the swirling emotions of Romanticism, a movement that passionately rejected cold rationality in favor of intuition, wild nature, and the mysterious pull of the ancient past. It was within this fertile ground of imagination and nationalistic fervor that the Druid was reborn, not as he truly was, but as the Romantic era desperately needed him to be. This revival was not led by archaeologists, a science that did not yet exist, but by a new breed of passionate amateurs known as antiquarians. These were gentlemen scholars, poets, and artists who traveled the countryside, sketching ruins and speculating wildly about their origins. At the forefront of this movement was William Stukeley, a trained physician and Anglican clergyman with a boundless fascination for Britain's ancient landscapes. In the 1740s, Stukeley spent years meticulously surveying and drawing the stone circles of Stonehenge and Avebury, producing beautifully detailed records that were, in their own way, both a great service and a tremendous disservice to history. Working with almost no factual information about the actual Iron Age Druids, Stukeley and his contemporaries performed a breathtaking act of historical conjuring. They looked at the immense, awe-inspiring scale of Stonehenge and could not conceive that such grandeur belonged to what they considered primitive, ancient Britons. They needed a noble architect, a wise and sophisticated priest-philosopher to match the majesty of the monuments, and so they anointed the Druids for the role. In Stukeley's influential book, Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids, he confidently and completely erroneously linked the megaliths to the Druidic class, creating an association so powerful that it persists in the popular imagination to this day. But Stukeley's reinvention went far beyond mistaken real estate. he radically reshaped the Druids' very character to fit the ideals of his time. Drawing on the classical sources that mention the Druids' belief in a single supreme god and the immortality of the soul, Stukely reimagined them not as pagan polytheists, but as primitive monotheists, wise, virtuous proto-Christians who had somehow intuited the core tenets of the true faith long before the gospel arrived in Britain. In his eyes, they were noble savages uncorrupted by modern decadence, who worshipped the divine in the pure cathedral of nature. This purified, almost saintly figure was a direct product of the romantic desire for a pure, spiritual past, a direct counterpoint to the industrial grime and social upheaval of the burgeoning modern age. This newly forged image was eagerly adopted and amplified by the emerging romantic poets and artists, who saw in the Druid the perfect symbol of their ideals. The Welsh poet and antiquarian Ilo Morganwg took the fabrication even further, founding the modern Gorset of Bards, a ceremonial group that claimed a direct, though entirely invented, lineage back to the ancient Druids. He composed elaborate rituals, complete with ornate robes and ceremonies held at stone circles, blending his own imagination with fragments of Welsh tradition to create a compelling and completely unhistorical pageant. Painters like William Blake and later Augustus John depicted Druids as majestic, bearded patriarchs, draped in flowing white robes, often standing in misty groves or before towering stones, their faces etched with profound, ancient wisdom. This visual archetype, a complete fiction born on an 18th century canvas, became the default image for the Druid, replacing any messy historical reality with a clean, dramatic, and marketable icon. The consequences of this romantic reinvention are twofold and profound. On one hand, it was a creative and cultural success of staggering proportions. It rescued the Druids from oblivion and installed them as powerful national symbols for Wales, Ireland, and Britain as a whole, providing a deep, albeit manufactured, mythological roots for national identity. It inspired a wave of artistic, literary, and musical works that celebrated the ancient past. It also laid the groundwork for the modern neo-pagan and Druidic revival movements, which, while often acknowledging the historical inaccuracies, draw inspiration from this romantic vision of a nature-based, wise spirituality. On the other hand, it created a historical blind spot that scholars are still working to correct. For over 200 years, the popular understanding of the Druids was dominated by Stukely's fantasies and Blake's paintings. This made it incredibly difficult for genuine archaeology to be heard. The real Druids, the politically powerful, legally sophisticated, and sometimes brutally practical intellectuals of the Iron Age, were buried under layers of mystical whitewash. The romantic Druid is a beautiful, compelling, and entirely fictional character, a mirror held up to the 18th century that reflects its own dreams of purity, wisdom, and a lost golden age, rather than a window into the true and far more complex world of the ancient Celts. The echoes of the ancient Druids, once nearly silenced by conquest and time, have found a powerful and resonant voice in the modern world, giving rise to a vibrant tapestry of spiritual and philosophical movements known collectively as modern Druidry. This contemporary revival is not a single, monolithic entity, but rather a spectrum of practices, ranging from fraternal societies and ecologically minded philosophical groups to deeply spiritual neo-pagan paths that seek to reconnect with the sacredness of the natural world. At its heart, this modern awakening is a testament to the enduring appeal of the Druidic archetype, the seeker of wisdom, the guardian of nature, and the bridge between community and cosmos, and it manifests in two primary, though often overlapping, forms: eclectic neo-pagan Druidry and the more rigorous approach of Celtic Reconstructionism. On one end of this spectrum lies the broad and inclusive world of neo-pagan Druidry. This path often draws inspiration from a wide array of sources, including the romanticized visions of the 18th century, classical texts, Celtic mythology, and sometimes even elements from other indigenous spiritual traditions. The focus here is less on historical reenactment and more on personal spiritual experience, ecological connection, and creative ritual. Groups like Our Endreot Fain, known as the ADF or Our Own Magic, exemplify this approach. Founded by the renowned Druid Isaac Bonewits, the ADF describes itself as a pan-Indo-European pagan church. It encourages its members to develop their own relationship with the divine, drawing from the hearth cultures of the ancient Celts, Norse, Greeks, Balts, and others to create a modern, polytheistic practice that is both structured and adaptable. The goal is not to perfectly replicate the past, which they acknowledge is impossible, but to build a living, breathing spirituality for today that honors the core principles they believe the ancient Druids embodied: reverence for nature, piety towards the gods, and the lifelong pursuit of wisdom. Parallel to these spiritual movements are the fraternal and philosophical Druidic orders, whose roots often stretch back to the Romantic Revival itself. The most famous of these is the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in London in 1781. This organization, and others like it, were established not as pagan religious groups but as friendly societies, beneficial clubs that provided mutual support and fellowship for their members during the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution. Their ceremonies, while drawing on Druidic symbolism and often held at ancient sites like Stonehenge, are typically more focused on moral and philosophical development, charity, and community service rather than the worship of Celtic deities. For many in these orders, being a Druid is about belonging to a tradition of learning and self-improvement, embracing values of truth, compassion, and stewardship of the environment, all within the framework of a shared historical narrative, however romanticized its origins may be. In deliberate contrast to these more eclectic approaches stands Celtic Reconstructionism, often abbreviated as CR. This path is characterized by its scholarly and methodical dedication to building a spiritual practice that is as historically grounded as possible within a modern context. Reconstructionists engage in what they call unverified personal gnosis, but place a much higher value on verified sources, archaeological evidence, critical translations of medieval texts, historical linguistics, and the study of surviving folk practices in the Celtic nations. Their aim is to carefully sift through the layers of folklore, romantic invention, and Christian influence to discern the bedrock of pre-Christian Celtic belief and practice. For a CR Druid, or a Paganach as some might say in Scottish Gaelic, the goal is cultural continuity and authenticity. Their rituals are painstakingly built around the genuine Gaelic or Brythonic festivals, using traditional offerings and invocations to deities whose names and attributes are drawn directly from the oldest sources available. It is a path that requires discipline, study, and a deep respect for the cultures it seeks to honor, often involving the learning of a Celtic language as a fundamental act of connection and reverence. While these different paths may seem divergent, they are all united by a common thread: a profound and urgent call to re-enchant our relationship with the natural world. Whether through the creative ritual of a neo-pagan circle or the historically informed offering of a reconstructionist, modern Druids of all stripes see themselves as guardians of the earth. They actively engage in environmental activism, wildlife conservation, and sustainable living, viewing these not as political statements but as sacred duties. This ecological imperative is perhaps the most significant and direct legacy of the ancient Druids' worldview. Translated into a modern context, they strive to once again see the world as a sacred nemeton, a grove where every tree, river, and creature is imbued with spirit and worthy of respect. In an age of climate crisis and ecological disconnect, this aspect of Druidry offers a powerful and compelling framework for finding our place within the web of life, not as dominators of nature, but as conscious and responsible participants within it. Separating the historical Druids from the layers of myth and modern reinvention is perhaps the most challenging task for anyone seeking to understand them. The truth is, our knowledge rests on a narrow but sturdy foundation of evidence, While much of what saturates popular culture is built on centuries of speculation, romantic fabrication, and outright fiction, the core of what we can say with reasonable confidence comes from a critical synthesis of archaeology and the most reliable classical accounts. We know they formed a highly educated, elite class that served as judges, philosophers, and religious leaders across Celtic societies. Their training was famously oral and extensive, spanning up to 20 years, and they held immense political sway, advising kings and having the authority to halt battles. Archaeological finds, like the preserved bog bodies that show evidence of ritualistic practices, lend grim credence to Roman claims about human sacrifice in times of extreme crisis. We also know they held the natural world in profound reverence, conducting their most sacred rituals in forest groves, near springs, and on hilltops, believing these were places where the veil between worlds was thinnest. This verified picture stands in stark contrast to the popular myths that began flourishing in the 18th century. The most persistent of these is the direct association of Druids with stone circles like Stonehenge. In reality, these megalithic monuments were already thousands of years old by the time the Celtic cultures emerged. The Druids may have used them, but they certainly did not build them. The now iconic image of the elderly, bearded Druid in a long white robe and hood is almost entirely a Victorian invention, popularized by artists and early antiquarians like William Stukeley, who reimagined them as noble proto-Christian sages. Furthermore, there is absolutely no historical evidence to support the idea that Druids used curved, bladed sickles as ritual tools. That particular detail is a modern fantasy. The concept of them being primarily solitary hermits or tree huggers also misses the mark. They were deeply integrated into the very heart of political power and community life, not isolated from it. The 20th and 21st centuries have added new layers of unverified claims onto this already complex tapestry. Many New Age and neo-pagan interpretations, while meaningful to their practitioners, often project a universal, goddess-centric spirituality onto the Druids that lacks any basis in the archaeological or historical record. The idea of Druids as purely peaceful, egalitarian nature priests is more a reflection of modern environmental ideals than of Iron Age reality. There is also no evidence they used a complex system of tree-based astrology or an Ogham alphabet for divination in the way it is often practiced today. These are later developments that have been retrospectively attached to them. While the Druids were undoubtedly keen astronomers and used writing for mundane purposes, their sacred knowledge was purposely kept oral, meaning any specific details about their rituals, prayers, or theological beliefs are, for the most part, irrevocably lost to us. This leaves us with a fascinating paradox. The very act of stripping away the myths and inventions does not diminish the Druids. In a way, it makes them more remarkable. By acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, we honor the true nature of their mystery. They were not mysterious because they were shrouded in the mists of a fictional Avalon, but because they were intellectuals who chose to entrust their entire world's wisdom to the human mind, refusing to commit it to a medium that could be conquered or easily understood by outsiders. The silence they left behind is not an empty void but a resonant space. It is a silence that challenges us to distinguish between what we wish was true and what the fragments of evidence actually tell us, reminding us that some histories are meant to be felt as much as they are to be known, their power lying not in answers, but in the awe-inspiring weight of the questions they continue to ask. So as our journey through the mists of time comes to a close, we're left with a profound appreciation for the Druids not as a single note in history, but as the entire symphony of Celtic civilization. They were the ultimate polymaths, the indispensable conductors of a complex society, weaving together the threads of law, faith, knowledge, and power into a cohesive cultural tapestry. They were the judges whose word could silence armies, the astronomers who read the stories written in the stars, the poets whose verses could bless a king or curse him into oblivion, and the healers who understood the subtle medicine of the earth. They formed the very backbone of their world, a class of intellectual and spiritual elites whose authority was the glue that held the tribal fabric together, ensuring both earthly order and cosmic harmony. Their enduring mystery, the very source of their timeless fascination, lies in the profound paradox they represent, a people of immense learning and influence who deliberately chose to leave no written record of their own. They placed their entire faith in the human mind, in the sacred act of oral transmission, believing that true wisdom was a living force that could not be captured on a page without losing its power. This commitment to memory over manuscript means their most intimate thoughts, their most sacred chants, and their deepest theological insights are lost to us forever, existing now only as echoes in the myths written down by others centuries later. Yet it is precisely this silence that speaks so loudly, inviting us to listen more closely to the landscape they revered, to read between the lines of the histories written by their conquerors, and to marvel at an intellectual tradition so powerful it could govern a continent for centuries without a single sacred text. What calls to us across the centuries, perhaps, is the haunting relevance of their worldview. In an age of climate crisis and digital disconnection, their deep, animistic kinship with the natural world feels less like a primitive superstition and more like a prescient wisdom. They did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as participants in a living, breathing cosmos where every grove was a temple and every spring a portal to the divine. This reverence for the earth, combined with their relentless pursuit of knowledge, a pursuit that wove together science, spirituality, and art into a single, holistic understanding, offers a compelling alternative to the fractured way we often experience the modern world. They remind us that the pursuit of truth is not a narrow path, but a vast and interconnected web. Their physical disappearance, hastened by Roman blades and imperial decrees, was not an end but a remarkable transformation. In Ireland especially, we see their legacy not being erased but being absorbed into the very cultural DNA of the nation. They didn't vanish, they evolved. The Brehon judges became the inheritors of their legal wisdom, the monastic scribes the new preservers of knowledge, and the very rhythms of the Celtic year were baptized into a new faith, ensuring the old ways would endure under new names. The Druids became a powerful cultural memory, a symbol of native wisdom and resilience, their spirit flowing like an underground river through Irish folklore, literature, and identity, forever marking the Celtic soul with a unique blend of practicality and magic, of fierce independence and deep connection to the land. We are left then not with answers but with a more beautiful set of questions. The Druids challenge us to consider what we choose to remember and how we choose to preserve it. They invite us to look at a standing stone or an ancient oak and feel the presence of a deeper history. Their story is ultimately a testament to the fact that the most powerful legacies are not always carved in stone, but are often whispered on the wind, carried in stories, and woven into the identity of a people long after the last torch has been extinguished in the sacred grove. We'd love to hear from you. What is it about the Druids that captures your imagination the most? Is it their role as powerful advisors, their mystical connection to nature, or the profound mystery of their silent history? Share your thoughts in the comments below.